Welcome to Top of the Ops, the podcast where we have real conversations about what happens behind the scenes of startups. I'm Bea, ex-VC at Lakestar and now Chief of Staff at Praktika.
And I'm Cecilia, ex-VC at Talis Capital and now FD at PortalOne. Well, today is not just us. We're super happy to have our guest, Gaby, which is an ex-chief of staff both at McKinsey and Codat, and now the founder of Robin, a consultancy that helps founders identify and place the single most important hire they'll ever make, their right hand. Hi, Gaby.
Hey, guys. Really excited to be here.
Super excited to have you on board. Let's get straight into it. Starting with your chief of staff experience, which spanned from, McKinsey, huge consultants to Codat, startup and scale up. Can you maybe talk us through how the chief of staff role looked differently at each company and maybe what surprised you the most from making the jump from consulting to a growth stage startup?
I think, firstly, I didn't plan to be a chief of staff. I fell into it at McKinsey, and the role there was very much supporting the managing partner. And I just loved it. I think I've just always been quite a generalist by nature in any role that I've had before. And I just was so excited that I found something that I felt I could get really excited about and allowed me to have breadth, but also at a time when I was quite junior in my career to have that really special exposure to the managing partner, the senior team at a huge company. In terms of what the role was at McKinsey, it was definitely what I would describe as the conductor roles. The managing partner had an incredible support system around them. So the job was very much bringing the right people together at the right moment to move things forward, making sure that the leadership team of the organization was super aligned and nothing was falling through the cracks. And it's somewhere like McKinsey, you have such institutional authority behind you. You have the structure around you and just a very clear sense of what good looked like. I knew I loved the role, but I really wanted to see what that looked like in a totally different environment, right? Almost the other end of the spectrum, high growth, scale up. So went and found that at Codat, where none of what I described existed at all. And it was the role where I was just getting involved in everything. It's turned into build that organizational scaffolding, which was great, but also dipping down into some really key areas where they just needed extra support as well. It was way more hands-on, which meant it was a great learning opportunity for me as well. In terms of what surprised me, at Codat, I felt that the stakes were a lot higher. Every decision that you're making has real tangible consequences to the organization, to the team, to the company. And that would make you think, therefore how we operate maybe is slightly more risk averse and slightly more cautious. And obviously the opposite is true. You're just moving quickly, failing fast, iterating faster, and the mindset around that being, that's fine. That was what I just loved for someone who I think has a bit of an innate sense of a bias to action and agency. That was just where I was like, this is an environment I can really thrive.
Thank you. That was such a good overview. I guess you went from chief of staff to founder.
Yeah.
Did being in the chief of staff role help you being a founder?
Considering what I'm doing now, yes. I am now operating in a space where I'm solving a problem that is relating to the chief of staff ecosystem. So having had that experience has put me in a really good position to be able to solve that problem. In terms of the skill set, I hope so. I talk a lot to chiefs of staff about this now. A big question that comes up is what comes next after the chief of staff? And I think chief of staff to founder is definitely a trajectory that you see quite often. Why is that? I think because as a chief of staff, you do a lot of things. As a founder, you're doing everything too. Also, as a chief of staff, something that really helped set me up in the right way was you're seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly because of that relationship that you have with the founder. So I think your expectation is that it's going to be super hard. You've seen the emotional ups and downs as well. It's definitely helped me probably be more resilient in moments where I've really needed that.
I completely agree with that. I think as a chief of staff, you de-glamorize the figure of a founder because you see everything that happens behind the scene and how much hardship they actually go through. That also brings you so much more awareness of what it actually takes and the less fancy things that you have to go through when you're funding something yourself, actually.
And then the one thing I would add to that as well is the one thing I've maybe missed about the chief of staff role and I've had to almost unlearn is the chief of staff role, you've got that partnership with the founder, and you've also got a team around you. You're all there working to the same mission and outcome. And when it comes to decisions, you're not the one maybe holding that decision-making authority. You're often helping inform that and being more of a thought partner. I then struggled with being like, okay, I just need to decide and commit. And that always falling to me is quite draining, but also exciting, right? That it's all on me, and that makes the opportunity greater.
I admire anybody who enters the founding journey so much. Maybe talking about the chief of staff role, you wrote recently on LinkedIn that 2026 is the year of the chief of staff. We're seeing it too. When I joined Sakera over 2 years ago as a chief of staff, most people were not really sure what the role was or what I was doing. But now there's so many job openings. Why? Why do you think that is? What has changed in the operating environment?
I think that's something that gets me going because it's definitely a trendy role at the moment, and someone like me is probably adding to that noise, I hope in a helpful way. But even though it's becoming more popular, I totally agree it's becoming popular for good reason, and I think it's a consequence of what we're seeing in the environment around it. I think the role of the leader has really changed. Not just changed, but expanded. So it's not just, founders are busier than ever. I think the scope of the role itself has changed. The founder is expected to be the strategic operator, a culture setter, a really great communicator, a crisis manager, and still also the person just making 50 micro decisions a day. That's not necessarily a bandwidth problem, it's a structural problem. So the role of leader has just become too big for one person to really hold in a sustainable, effective way. I'm seeing that because founders wouldn't be just looking for a chief of staff because of hype. I think they're feeling their bandwidth, their leverage lessening. The second thing is the execution. And this is the thing, no matter what stage, size, type of founder that I'm speaking to, this is the thing that comes up time and time again. And the execution pressure on companies at the moment is bigger than ever. The startups are leaner, you want to do more with less people. The days of building with like a huge, large inflated team or inflated leadership team are no more. So the expectation on founders to move fast, run tight, make real progress with fewer people, that's a real thing. And that environment creates a very specific kind of pressure that you can't really solve by hiring more specialists. So that's where like this value around the generalists that's really come in. So someone who can sort of move fast across multiple areas, can context switch, can also hold the context of the whole company, like that's becoming really valuable. And then the third is obviously, how long could we have a podcast about this without mentioning AI? This shows up in a couple of ways for a chief of staff. One is AI can do a lot of the doing. So therefore, the chief of staff role is more important because it's the judgment, the nuance, the bringing the people together, the bit connective tissue that AI cannot do yet. Also in terms of how teams are thinking about implementing it, how they should approach the experimentation and moving quickly with this. That often and should I'm with the chief of staff. They're the ones that are operating cross-functionally.
Absolutely. I would like to get into the meaty stuff because your core thesis seems to be that founders know that they need support, but many times they don't know in what shape or form that would come or what they actually need. Do they need support? But that could be in various different ways. Could you walk us through what is your diagnosis process with the founder? What questions do you ask them and how do you assess what type of support they need?
That's exactly why I started Robin, because I was seeing all these chief staff roles coming up. Great. But getting into job descriptions and like a seed stage biotech had the same job description as a Series C fintech with like 250 plus people. That just can't be true. And you wouldn't expect that of any other role, whether it's CFO, that job description. It needs a different type of person. It's the scope is different.
I don't think I had a job description. I'm not sure if you had a job description, B. Let's be real.
I did not have a job description. I didn't even apply. The role was not out. I just like kind of volunteered myself to an angel investment that I made.
But I think also that creates problems, right? Like you're saying, oh, we need something, come and do something. And then a person gets lost.
Exactly. So what I try and do is when I sit down with the founder, and they always know they need support because they can feel it. So that's the first thing. It's not that they need convincing on, I think you need help here. They're sold on that bit, but it's like, what does the shape of that support look like? And normally in those conversations, right, the founder really wants to be like, this is who I need. This is what I need. You know, this is the sort of job description we've come up with. And it's like, okay, let's take a step back. Like, and that's where I really hone down in like trying to understand where the pain and what those pain points are, like where they live in the business. So not what they think they need, like very much what they're feeling. What's becoming harder to sustain as the company grows, where things slow down without them being involved. You know, 9 times out of 10, a founder will come to me and they say they need someone who can execute. Things aren't getting done, priorities are stalling, they're the bottleneck, and that's definitely valid, but underneath it, there's usually something more specific that's driving it. So I really try and drill down into what that is. For sort of, we talk about any role, I just have to understand the business, you know, where it is at now and what's going to get meaningfully harder as the company is scaling and growing in complexity, right? And then I go into the founder themselves, because the chief of staff role is unique in the fact that it's for the business, but it also leverages the founder and the CEO, the exec that you're supporting. So walk me through a typical week. Where does your time usually go? Where do you personally still feel that you're needing to step in because it still is materially improving the outcome? Or where do decisions slow down or lose clarity if you're not in the room? Also a little bit more about their working style, who they work with best. That conversation really tell me like where that problem is. Is it capacity? Is it judgment, trust, execution? And those things all lead to quite different hires or a different profile.
You mentioned profiles before, and I had wanted to dig in more because I believe there's so many, for each founder profile, there's a chief of staff profile.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what you've found so far and how do you tend to categorize those profiles and those archetypes?
It's something like that I'm really trying to work on and codify, because you could definitely get into the detail and the psychology of the types of people that work like this and therefore who complements them. I think a chief of staff works well when they complement the founder in terms of their skill set. A founder I worked with actually described that he thinks of talent in 3 parts: skill sets, behaviors, and values. For a chief of staff to complement their founder in those 2 things, the skill sets and behaviors, is really nice. You've got that solid alignment of the values and what you're driving towards. But in terms of the skill set, if the founder's product led, this person can carry the rest of the business. If this founder is more introverted and the culture comm side isn't supernatural to them, having a chief of staff who can talk and build relationships across the whole business, that's really helpful. So you can work down on narrowing down what that looks like very specifically, but broadly I like to take that approach initially.
Even hearing you talking and thinking about my relationship with my previous CEO, it was very much like that, like values completely aligned, but very different people with different skill set. And even he was more of a optimist and more of like a reality check kind of person. And I think you need that to create a healthy balance of creating healthy debate and healthy challenges between that duo. And I think that works very well.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question related to when do you actually tell founders that they don't need a chief of staff? As in, when do they need a founder associate instead of a chief of staff? Like, and what is the difference? Perhaps just to take it a step back.
I think it's great that the founder's associate role is getting the same amount of sort of exposure to the chief of staff as well. It's a really great role. What I try to do is when I'm speaking with a founder, I try and get them off title, because sometimes they can come in and be like, I need a founder associate, I need a chief of staff, and then you can fall down that rabbit hole. The title is almost where the confusion starts. Like, they've seen someone post about chief of staff on LinkedIn, or a founder they respect has mentioned it, and it's formed from there versus taking that problem first approach. So I tend to bring it back to two things, because there are really two types of chaos a founder can be experiencing, and each one tends to point to a different higher. So if your business is really feeling chaotic, so projects are stalling, no operating rhythm, things are getting 60% done and no further, that's like more of an operations problem, and that tends to need a founder's associate, someone who is working on the doing and working in the business and getting things done. If the organization is feeling chaotic, but it's more around priorities being unclear, leadership not aligned, the vision is just not translating into execution the way it should, that's a different problem. And that's where we're in chief of staff territory. It's someone who works on the business. Chief of staff can also work in the business, but founders associates usually are just in. So it's not just around execution, but you're really wanting someone to have judgment about what should be executed and why. I don't want a load of founders associates coming at me, because I'm sure they're pushing up into that as well. The boundaries are blurred, but you've got to start somewhere in sort of how you define that, and that's what I've found to be most useful.
I think it's like the clearest definition that I heard between the roles, but ultimately the chief of staff has the strategy layer, and a lot of it is trying to translate the big blurry vision into actualizing, making the vision happen. So
it's making sure that the company is set up to execute, are the systems aligned and able to be scaled in a way that makes sure that execution happens like a machine.
Moving forward, you've realize that a founder needs somebody and that somebody's a chief of staff. It's a really hard hire to make. So I'd love to know your process and your top 3 suggestions and tips for founders when they're hiring for a chief of staff and the interview process.
You really need to make sure that you've really aligned on like the criteria that you're going after. And I come back to those 3 points. So the values, behaviors, and skill sets. What makes the chief of staff hire so hard is that, yes, there is a little bit of skill set and making sure they've got that competency, but actually I think it's the values and behaviors where you really want this person to spike, and they're notoriously the tough bits to test. But if you have to be really clear on what it is you need, and that's why the scoping conversation is so important. And then you have to get clear on how you're going to test for those things. And I always start with a conversation with the founder, because that is just the non-negotiable. That relationship, having a working chemistry, is really important. And at the moment, there's a lot of great talent looking for these roles, and the companies that I'm working with need to do a really good job at selling to the best talent. If you want someone really great, it's not just a case of, we can get anyone without much effort. That really is a two-way conversation where the candidate is making sure they feel really aligned with the mission, how the founders thinking, and the approach. What I really think is a non-negotiable as well now is some case study or task. I think it's really hard with the chief of staff role to just go off like conversations and vibes, especially if you've had, a referral. You do just need to have something that allows you to see certain qualities that you want to test for. And that is not necessarily like deep subject matter expertise. I actually think the opposite. That's why I really like things like a live case study. Because often founders will say, I really want like a sparring partner with this person. It's like, well, let's test that capability. Let's get them in the room. Let's give them a chance to be prepared for the conversation, but not overly prepared where they've been able to ChatGPT it a million times and come in with a really sophisticated answer. Let's talk about an actual problem that you're facing and let's have a whiteboarding session on it. And then you're really having like a good conversation, seeing how they think live, how they're structuring their thoughts, how they're communicating, how they're asking questions when they don't know the answer but want to dig deeper. I think that's so much more suited to testing the right person. And then just a standard process from there. If you want this person to be working with a lot of different stakeholders, then make sure they have a chance to meet those stakeholders and make sure they've got buy-in as well.
When do you know when a chief of staff and founder pairing isn't going to work? Like, can you see some early warning signs, or what do you tell the founders to like look out for?
There's a few things. And on both sides, founders to look out for and also a candidate to look out for. And it's real life relationships. There's someone out there for everyone, but you have to find that fit. I would say you have to be really clear as a candidate on what you want and what's your non-negotiables and what matters in terms of who you want to work closely with. Is it that your values are really aligned? Is it that the founder is really people-centric in his thinking, or actually do you just care about like pure ambition and the high intensity culture that they set? Like, it's on you and your responsibility to test for those in a conversation. A low ego founder is really important to you, which, you know, comes up a lot. You want him to be self-aware, right? And so ask her in the conversation, how do you think about your strengths and weaknesses? You're allowed to have these conversations. What are the red flags? You have to trust your instinct on those things. It's so hard for me to judge that. I just push people to be really clear on what they like, what they work with well, and facilitate environments in which those things can show up. So whether that's the first initial 30-minute call, a separate coffee, speaking with other stakeholders in the business and asking how they work with them, there's different ways to test that.
I think also feeling empowered to ask the questions in terms of how do you work, or what kind of people, create frictions within you. I think as a chief of staff, you need to have that like trusted symbiotic relationship with your CEO. And if you don't feel comfortable asking those questions to begin with, that's probably a red flag, because you're going to have to create a deep bond that it's based on trust.
And if the founder isn't willing to share openly, then that would be my biggest red flag, because all you need is just transparency and communication to work. And it's funny, in interview processes as a candidate, you can feel maybe not so empowered to ask, or you're conscious about how that comes across. But it's a non-starter if that relationship just isn't working.
It is so important because it's the single person. You're just going to chat every day about everything. And if you don't have that chemistry, it's impossible. I have a controversial question. Is there a typical background for chief of staff that you have found to be quite successful? Let's say people that come from venture capital or people that come from any other background that tends to be the most successful. And why do I only know women chief of staff? Where are all the guys? And does that work so that the founders tend to be typically male, and so we tend to be good support from them? Why? I'm very curious to have your view about
I've
this.
got a controversial answer for that one as well. First, in terms of profile, there just isn't anything typical. I think the most typical that you might get is a foundation in consultancy, VC, investment banking, plus then 1 or 2 years in an operating environment where they've done something like growth or product or ops, and then they elevate into the chief of staff role. That's probably as typical as it gets, but I can't tell you enough how varied those profiles can be, and you've got to be clear on what you want to look out for. And that's why it's such a difficult search, because a lot of those behaviors can only be tested on conversations like this, where you're really wanting to understand what's their motivation, what's their like intention in their career. The one thing that is consistent is whatever role they've done, they've had like really tangible impact. Like the execution point has been really clear. But I think someone who like cares deeply and can really point to where they've moved the needle, that's what stands out more than your tier one names or whatever it might be. And then to your second question, I speak to chiefs of staff all the time and I haven't done the numbers on it, but I would say 80% plus are women. And I think because it's, if you take a step back, like what makes a really successful chief of staff, it's having that generalist skill set, the ability to context switch, be involved in multiple things at multiple times. It's having a super high EQ. It's building those relationships with people at all levels of the organization. And it's being super low ego. A lot of the work that you do as a chief of staff is invisible work, right? And you have to be happy with championing and leveraging someone else. And it's not about saying, oh, by the way, that was me. It's like, if this organization is running super seamlessly, I know that's me, but normally you get called out when things are on fire. Those three qualities, and I'm sure there's others, they tend to lend themselves to women. And I don't think that's a controversial statement to make, in the way that the world of work and how it was has been set up for history has lent itself to men succeeding in those environments. I think we're seeing a shift. But the one thing that I think will be really interesting is if you believe, and I do, that the chief of staff cohort is almost tomorrow's leaders. If you see them as that's the platform for the next founders, the next heads off, the next C-suite, then we've got an amazing pipeline of women coming up. Will that convert? That is to be seen, and then it'll be a question if not. But we should see a huge fucking conversion in terms of those women becoming like the leaders and the future leaders of tomorrow, and a pipeline of 80% is pretty nice. So it will be interesting to see if that happens.
Maybe one last question before we move into the rapid fire. You've done your prep, you've done your hires, the chief of staff is starting. Why does that fail? What can founders do to avoid a chief of staff hire that it's great on paper from failing?
There's things to be done from the chief of staff side and then from the founder side. From the chief of staff side, the first is building trust with the founder. That's just number one, and you have to do that quickly. Don't feel pressured about doing that. Building trust and earning that trust takes time, but definitely start that from day one. You cannot do this role without their trust. Just get early wins on the board. If you said something, do it. I'll get this back to you by X, and do that. I'll follow up here and do that. It's these small habits that develop that trust over time. And then allow yourself to learn how the founder thinks, decides, prioritize, like operates under pressure. Just absorb it all, be in person as much as you can with them. If possible, you want to understand them so well that you almost become like interchangeable. The second is build relationships across those first 30 days. Just coffee chat after coffee chat after coffee chat. You want to also break the misconception of a chief of staff being a spy. If they've not had a chief of staff in that organization before, there's almost mistrust about it. Where be really clear around how you position yourself internally and that you're there to be helpful to them. And yes, that means working closely with the founder, but that's got a really great business impact for them and how they show up every day. So get people on side and just develop like really genuine relationships. The third is around the clarity and communicating relentlessly and repetitively. In the early days, the role is going to feel ambiguous. That's okay. Your role is going to evolve, and you have to be proactive about identifying where you can help. That won't be obvious on day one. Constantly check in and be clear about what you're working on, why, communicate that to the people around you, to your founder, to yourself. Sometimes it's so easy for days to go by and feel like I've been busy, but what actually have I moved the needle on? And then from the founder side, like their single most important thing is probably communication. They should feel they're over communicating to the nth degree, because in those first 30 days, they just need to be sharing every thought that they're having out loud. Sometimes I even say, like, do a end of day voice note debrief. And even if there's no like actions that are coming from that, you get a sense for like how they think. And I just think to offload like that is just really helpful to hear that thought process out loud. Then the second thing is access and authority. This is where most founders accidentally like restrict the role before it even starts. Like a chief of staff without authority just becomes a facilitator. You need to be really clear about the ownership and authority and where those boundaries sit. That is the difference between having like a good and a great chief of staff. So they will naturally push on that and build the confidence in just taking that without permission. In those early days, for that to happen, you sort of need to be quite clear around it. And the third for them is just delegate really properly. Be clear on what you're asking for. It doesn't mean that it's hand-holding, but to set up that relationship in the early days, be really clear on what the ask is, and then also let go of the ask. Give the chief of staff the opportunity to build that trust and really deliver for you. The letting go aspect is really hard for founders. So to actively use that muscle from day one is what I tend to push them to do. And it's hard because when I've placed a chief of staff, the founder usually hasn't had a chief of staff. And more often than not, the chief of staff has not been an actual chief of staff before. It's tricky. So all you can do in that is sit down and just communicate. I don't think this is working. Great, fine, let's change it. Just that acceptance of there's going to be ups and downs, but we're on the same team and let's just communicate through it is the key to any relationship, never mind chief of staff and founder.
And I think women are, generally speaking, good at communicating.
Yeah.
So that's also why I cannot really think of a chief of staff hire that failed. I just don't know many of them. So the churn rate of people that I know in chief of staff role has been really, really low.
Yeah, they definitely exist. What's quite nice sometimes is maybe they're just not made for the chief of staff role, but they're a good talent for somewhere else in the company. So you see an internal move versus it's been a total car crash, but the car crashes happen too.
Let's do the rapid fire.
Okay.
If you could fix one thing about how the tech ecosystem thinks about the chief of staff role, either one misconception or one bad habit, what would it be?
It would be that, it's just a trend, it's just a moment that in 2 years we'll look back and be like, what was all the fuss about with that chief of staff thing? The reason that frustrates me is just that it undersells what the role actually is and the value it has. The chief of staff role is not popular because it's fashionable. It's popular because the shape of building a company has changed, and this role is one of the best responses to that change. So I think the founders who treat it seriously, scope it properly, they will feel the difference. The ones who hire because everyone else is hiring it will probably conclude that it doesn't work because they've not done that properly.
Also, a chief of staff is not a cheap software subscription that you just get because everybody else is getting.
I know. This is an expensive hire to make, so it's an expensive mistake, right? It's definitely not one to just take lightly.
100%. So what's one habit to help manage the roller coaster of startup and founding life that you found that helps you ground or helps other chief of staff get grounded?
Yeah, a founder told me that she does a weekly written reflection. It sounds like you never have time for it, but she was like, if I can make time, you can make time. And she was like, it's really helpful when you're trying to do something yourself. Sometimes you just feel like you're losing an uphill battle. And actually, if you can sit down at the end of the week and think, what have I actually achieved? What have I done? And just write that down. That can be really helpful. And that's really helped me. It's also really helped me zone in on the bits that I really enjoy and get most energy from versus where I feel like I'm weaker. So as I start to think about what building a team might look like, I think that's really helping me get clarity around that.
I was doing weekly newsletters in my past role when I was heading the Biz of team, and it was so much fun. Maybe 10 minutes on a Friday. There was a lot of random sarcasm and then the list of the things that we did. And at the beginning of the week, I always I had this anxiety of, oh my God, have we even done enough? And at the end of the week, I would have loads of bullet points and updates to provide, and kind of feels you with okay, actually the week has gone by, but I've done something.
Yeah.
What is a fair salary for a chief of staff role, let's say at Series B company in London?
So to caveat that, firstly, the bandings are always quite broad for these roles. The important thing is to really hone in on what the scope of the role is and less around title and stage and just what that role is actually owning and doing day to day and the impact that you believe that role can have, which it should always be super high, the answer to that. The market data at the moment is probably pointing more to that, like 110 to 125, maybe pushing 130 for a super exceptional person. But I think in pounds, yeah. But I think averaging out around that 120 to 125.
Awesome. I think that it's a great reference point for founders watching and for other chief of staffs in their salary negotiations, because there's always a little bit of a hush around salary. Let's just like talk clearly. You have the market data, you hire, you consult founders in hiring. So let's just talk it out.
And just to add to that, I would say that is a portion of the total comp. So you're also expecting meaningful equity. And I would push founders to have a really compelling narrative as to why this person is joining this company and what's the upside potential for them as well.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Gaby. It's been great having you and learning more about the ins and outs of what you're doing with Robin and how many founders you're helping.
No, thank you so much. I've really loved it. This is my first podcast as well, so I'm honored.